Fred, first of all, I hope your introduction does not count against my 10 minutes. Secondly, I'm very pleased that after a very good lunch where we've all just had our own personal enlargement experience, that there are more people still in the audience than on the panel. I've been in the reverse situation, I can tell you, quite a few times. And I'm very pleased, obviously, to have this opportunity to be here today and to be invited. I was a bit sort of horrified when Fred told me that we were limited to 10 minutes. As all of you have heard me before know very well, I am a AAA graduate of the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking, which means that if you can't entertain them, you can always bore them. But I promised to do my best and to stick to the time frame. All those who know me also know that my subtitle is Dinosaur in Residence at NATO headquarters, because I'm the only surviving member of the international staff who was there before NATO was created, or so it seems these days. And certainly when you've been anywhere for a long time, time itself as an experience contracts, so that the accession of Poland to NATO 10 years ago strikes me as only yesterday. And in thinking about what I was going to say today, I had to remember that, in fact, although it seems like only yesterday, a fantastic amount has actually happened in the 10 years since Poland joined. But to my mind, it was not so much the enlargement itself in March 1999, which has transformed NATO to what it is today. It was more something that happened 9 days later when the Kosovo air campaign broke out. It must have been a bit of a shock, if not for Poland, at least for some of the other countries that were joining then, to join an alliance for Article 5 protection against territorial attacks, and to discover that the first role that you were being called on to play was to intervene in the Balkans in NATO's first live war in its history. In other words, to realise that this was an alliance where contributing would increasingly become the main criteria, not benefiting, or where at least benefiting would increasingly become directly proportionate to one's ability to contribute. Kosovo was the end of the unequal alliance, the alliance where one or two major allies were expected to provide the security, to take the risks, to assume the major responsibilities, and most of the others under the umbrella were able to benefit from that. It became a much more equal alliance where everybody was expected to contribute. As John F. Kennedy would have put it very famously, ask not what NATO can do for you, but what you can do for NATO. So solidarity, burden sharing, the European pillar were no longer abstract concepts, but essential, existential even, necessities. Now, Kosovo also marked a phase in NATO's history where we went from essentially being, the raison d'être of NATO was just to exist, to doing. And all of you know that doing is something which exposes your weaknesses as well as publicizes your strengths. Doing means that you cannot rest on past glories. It doesn't matter how successful we were in the Balkans in the 90s if we fail in Afghanistan today or tomorrow. Only, as with a football team, only your present performance matters to your future. The other thing, of course, is that we actually, for the first time, had to use our military forces. And we rapidly discovered that military forces are 100% successful in a deterrence mode where you don't actually use them, but are less than 100% successful, even with high technology and the revolution in military affairs, when they're involved in a live operation. This is something which I think is going to be critical to NATO's future, because although I listened today to the debate about Vernetzte Sicherheit and the comprehensive approach and the need for the military to increasingly support civilian activities, I don't disagree with that. But let's be honest, what NATO is all about is the ability to use multilateral military power. That is our added value. Take that away and we become a talking shop. Now, it strikes me that the lesson of Kosovo was that this was the end of war without tears. This was the end of a period when a very small use of military force could produce a maximum political effect. If you look at Afghanistan, where the United States has spent $176 billion so far, with 660 deaths, and of course to that you add the billions spent by other allies and the number of deaths, it's quite clear that compared to Kosovo, military force has been used in a much greater extent, with far larger numbers over a far longer period, to achieve far less. That's not to say that military force is irrelevant. I would never argue that. But I think NATO has to reflect all of the time, as our major function is to be able to conduct multilateral military operations, particularly at a time of financial crisis, is can we ask our taxpayers to put the money into major defence budgets and modernisation programmes if we as an alliance cannot demonstrate that that use of military force can produce security outcomes at an acceptable cost and an acceptable time frame. Transformation has never been more urgent. We must not do what T.S. Eliot, one of my favourite poets, once warned us against, which is to have the experience but to miss the meaning. The second or the third major change is that, and this ties into what I've just said, is that during the 90s, essentially the problem in NATO was to get to the decision point to actually use our military capabilities. We agonised endlessly in Bosnia, to a lesser extent in Kosovo, when was the right time to use force, under which conditions, under which constraints. But when we actually used the force, the campaigns lasted 9 days in Bosnia, 78 days in Kosovo, and an optimal outcome, at least in the short term, was achieved. Our goals were achieved. Nowadays, it strikes me that NATO, paradoxically, finds it easier and easier to get to the political decision-making point, but the implementation part, the resources, the sustainability to see the mission through becomes increasingly difficult. That's another lesson. In the 90s, the focus was overwhelmingly on the Euro-Atlantic area. Our partnerships were essentially those of our former adversaries. Interventions were designed to be short-term, and the interventions were designed to allow NATO to support other organisations rather than to take the lead. Also in the 90s, we were in the fortunate position that we didn't need anybody else to fulfil our fundamental security objectives. As long as we could mobilise our own internal membership, reach consensus and act, we were quite successful. But even where we did act and come into contact with others, we found that automatically they were there in a very supporting role. The EU was our natural partner in the process of enlargement. It was almost as if, rather like a masseur, if I can use this expression, NATO was working on the legs of the body to get those into shape, while the European Union was working on the torso and the arms and the head. So countries that joined the organisations were in much better shape, having gone through that dual process. And in the Balkans, the EU, the United Nations, the OSCE, the World Bank were automatically there, giving that reconstruction mission the same priority and similar resources to us. And as a football fan, when I think about this, I'm reminded of the song of Liverpool Football Club, you know, "You'll never walk alone." Well, NATO never had to walk alone.